Well, welcome to this conversation. I'm Cathy Hird. I'm a retired United Church minister, recently retired. I met Maggie in 1996. She was beginning her training for ordination, and I went to work with her at Cape Croker for 2 years. And then I pulled out, and Maggie stayed on, but I remained as the supervising minister. And so I had a wonderful introduction into Anishinaabe culture and story through Maggie. And she's been an important part of my journey and learning.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Cathy. My name is Maggie Dieter. I am a United Church minister currently serving at New Hamburg, just outside of Kitchener. And before that, I served a number of years, 9.5 years at the General Council office, serving in the Indigenous Justice, Indigenous Ministries unit as their executive minister. That after leaving the Saugeen Ojibwe territory, serving that area for 15 years. And Cathy was a wonderful companion as I started my journey in ministry, grounding me and giving me wonderful guidance. And I know that she was, Cathy, you were warmly welcomed, so much appreciated within the Nehashin community, and that relationship I know has lasted for you. You've maintained relationships through the years. So it's good to be with you today and good to have this conversation with you.
Yes, and you were one of the first people who came to mind for me when I heard about the Remit, which is the reason for this conversation. First of all, it's a category 3 remit. And if you don't vote, it counts as a no. Category 3 remits are really hard to get past. And so I really wanted to make sure that we provided congregations with as much information as we could. Mm-hmm. And the remit came as a response to the National Indigenous Council's request that the National Church identify and then remove the structural barriers. And the remit isn't exactly what was asked for, but I think that the purpose of the remit is to remove those barriers in the way that the Indigenous Church wants to, so that the Indigenous Church would have the freedom to develop structures that work for the Indigenous Church. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Is that what you're understanding?
Yeah, that's how I understand it, that it would enable the current iteration of the Indigenous Church to be able to define its structures and its processes without having to come to the General Council or executive or another remit to make these changes. So yeah, so I think you've captured that well. So and also I think in that is also the intention then to continue to develop new relationships, to create a new relationship in place of mission to Indians, partnership in God's creation to all the earth. So we're talking about structures and processes, but also relationships built on equity, respect, and mutuality. So, and those conversations, of course, we know, Cathy, have been going on for decades, and there's been a movement within our church for several years. So this is not something new. This is yet another step along the way.
And I was aware that I know something of that story, but not everyone would. And so telling that story is part of why we said, yeah, let's have this conversation. I remember being at the first regional gathering for Western Ontario Waterways, which is where I'm based, and suddenly realizing that the All Native Circle Conference was gone, and the National Indigenous Council and the Council of Elders did exist, but the structure wasn't there. And I felt this, oh my goodness, we've taken apart what the Indigenous church had built, and we don't yet have something else in place. And I felt, I guess I felt angry that that we didn't already have something like the All Native Circle. The frustration was there partly because this isn't the first time that we took apart structure without the Indigenous church being part of the conversation.
Yes, structures were taken apart with the change in the from conferences to regions and removing that level. The Indigenous church was impacted by that. So the All Native Circle Conference unfolded. But BC Native Ministries is still in existence. They still have a partnership or a relationship in some way. And I've been out of the loop for a little while, but I know that that's ongoing, as well as Ontario, Quebec, Indigenous church congregations. They have some sort of structure, informal, but a structure nonetheless where they can meet and have input into the national Indigenous body. So there was a coming apart of the conference, and that there was a lot of grief, and my sense is likely still a lot of grief. The All Native Circle Conference was formed in the 80s. One of the structures that emerged, or needs that emerged from the conversation. So it was a valued part of. And it's true, by the time the regions emerged and met, the Indigenous church was still not clearly defined. And at the time that whole restructuring happened, there was that tension because the Indigenous church timelines were quite different than the wider church's timelines. And our conversations in a sense were just beginning with the calls to the church, what I imagine we're going to talk a little bit more about later. But the timelines and the ways in which we engage community is so different that the times didn't align. So development wasn't there, but there was a lot of background work to be done. And I think it caught, my sense is, well, with any transition, but this in particular, because it was such a major shift, just caused that tension and the grief and all that comes with that. So it was a difficult time. There was a sense that where is the Indigenous church? Where are our representatives? And that new relationship hadn't been clarified or understood yet.
Well, and when I worked at Cape, elders would sometimes say to me, when we joined the United Church, and I found it, I wasn't sure what they were referring to. And then, they'd talk about some of the structural changes that they had to deal with when that happened. And I realized in 1925, when union happened, the Indigenous churches got plunked into the United Church. It was a change that my settler church did, and then and imposed on the Indigenous congregations. And then we did it again. We did it in the late 60s, early 70s with, sure, we were modernizing the United Church's structure, but we got rid of the Home Mission Board, which is where the Indigenous church knew they belonged. And suddenly that was gone. And the funding model changed completely. People had to figure out a whole new structure. We just keep imposing the change that the settler church thinks that it needs. And this remit will say, we're not imposing anymore. This time, you get to choose the structures.
Yeah, I think you're touching on something essential, and that's recognizing that the church has been colonizing and has contributed to this country's colonization of Indigenous peoples. There just wasn't that awareness, that dialogue. They would have had a rich history, at the time of union, but surprisingly, no, there was no consultation. It was just assumed. And so Indigenous voices, have emerged or began to emerge, even before the 80s. Things were happening within Indigenous communities and even nationally with the National Indian Brotherhood and other movements that were happening that really sparked conversations around, Indigenous communities, Indigenous people finding their own way and self-determining and developing their own ways of being. I mean, just to think about all of the heavy lifting that our predecessors, like Indigenous leaders, have done, to even get us to this point. I think there wasn't that awareness. There have been a number of events, reports, that have happened over the decades that have helped the church increasingly becoming aware of the colonizing history, and that it needs to change. We need a new relationship. So it's been a journey. It certainly has been a journey, and we're unlearning, we're unsettling. And that takes time because it's a deep transformation. It's right into the fabric of Canada, and right into the fabric of our church. So it takes a lot of unraveling and time to do. So a number of steps have been taken. And going back to that point you were talking about at Cape Croker at Nashing, they were sort of plunged into new relationships and engagement with one another. I mean, and I know there was likely, some real struggle in that, or, like building those relationships and creating some understanding. And I know, you and I were about some of that work when we were up in the Bruce Presbytery, creating understanding, education, and all of that. But it was as difficult as that is, it's also a gift to the church. We've grown, we've deepened understanding. Now, we're not there yet. We're on the road.
Yeah, very much. You mentioned the 80s a couple of times, and that is a bit of history that I hope the wider church does pay attention to, because Stan McKay, when he was working for the Division of Mission in Canada, began these series of consultations. Those were opportunities for people from across the country to gather, Indigenous people from across the country to gather and talk about what they needed. And your family was part of that.
Mm-hmm. I always wonder, now you have a story about, do you want to tell your story about the consultation at Grand River?
Yeah, my first husband was the minister at Ganawage, and so was participating in the consultations. He was inside, part of the conversation, and I was sitting outside in the sun reading a book. I would join them for lunch and heard a little bit about what was going on, and just stayed outside. And that memory came to me as I looked at the remit, because I trust that there will be conversation that happens inside between Indigenous people, and I will be sitting outside of that. Mm-hmm. And that's okay. There will be time for relationship and conversation together, but it's okay to have that conversation happening among the people who are affected. Mm-hmm. And as the Indigenous Church figures out how to embody their relationship to each other and to the wider church.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that time was a real turning point when Indigenous community said we need to have our own conversations, and that is still a need within the church to have space. That was a significant time in the church, because I do remember, actually it was my father who came home from one of those consultations, and I believe it happened in White Bear in Saskatchewan. And he was telling the story about how the leaders, the elders of the Indigenous community asked their settler friends, ministers to leave the room, and it was with respect and care and love, because there were important relationships, and the settler members of that meeting, they left. There have been years and years and years, hundreds of years of oppression and exclusion and silencing of voices that the indigenous peoples were saying, no, we're going to use our voice. And I think, to strengthen our voice, in the context of our own community, where we bring similar values, and I mean, it's not diverse, but yet similar in many ways, ideas and values. That's part of strengthening and healing who we are after years of not being at the table and not having a place to practice and strengthen our voice. And it is ours to have. I mean, it is our God-given voice. And I think about the apology. The church recognized that they didn't see what they were doing and did not recognize the value and the richness that was already present in Indigenous people. And so therefore, we're all impoverished because of that. So at the in the 80s, when that movement started to really strengthen, it really began. New things began to emerge, like the theological schools, pretty profound, to say, we're going to train our own leaders that understand Indigenous communities, but not only that, we're going to give them the kind of education and training where they can serve the whole church. They can serve in our Indigenous communities. We need leaders in our communities, and we need leaders within the whole of United Church of Canada. And so that happened first with the Dr. Jessie Soto Resource Center, and then with Francis Sandy. Of course, the two had to merge a few years back because of finances, but we still have the center in Manitoba, which continues to prepare people for leadership.
And it was the chance to say to each other, the regular theological colleges don't teach based on our values and culture. And that's, we need to learn in a way that fits. And the settler church had to realize that 4 years of university is not necessarily the only path to ordination.
Mm-hmm. Well, I chose the Francis Sandy Center to prepare me for ministry, and it was a powerful way to learn, to study, and to prepare for leadership, spiritual leadership within the United Church. So grateful for those ones who got together in the 80s and exercised their voice. Yeah, so in a number of things in the 80s, of course, the creation of both the BC Native Ministries and the All Native Circle Conference. Something also I noticed, sort of how the 80s, it seems, were a time of consultations, dialogue, but then some important sort of cornerstones were built, like the ANCC and the theological schools. And then in the 90s, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples in Canada, that was really the beginning of some truth-telling, some really essential truth-telling about Canada. And then the whole residential school, that, so there was some traction by Indigenous leaders and leaders within Canada, within the church, to begin to delve in and say, let's start getting at some of the truth of this. Indigenous people are more and more at the table within the church, are more and more, speaking, and not that Indigenous leaders haven't spoke before that, but within the context of our church, I think there was just a place established, a place that the Indigenous peoples claim to say, we're going to have a voice here.
Yeah, I think that the Port Alberni residential school trial really did surface for the rest of the church what Indigenous people knew, that had the residential schools had been a wrong from the beginning, and just because they were trying to take apart, in those schools were trying to take apart Indigenous culture, take the Indian out of the child. I mean, every elder I visited had stories. I hold those stories as teaching that helps me understand what the residential schools were about. But I remember that the lawyers in the church were saying, no, don't apologize, because that will affect how the lawsuit goes. And I remember feeling, this is bottom line. The first apology was kind of general, but this is one of the things that we did wrong. And if we really meant that first apology, this is something specific we need to apologize for. And then the general counsel executive didn't follow the lawyer's advice and did apologize for that specific action, and really accepted the role of needing to negotiate settlements.
It was the right thing for the church to do, for the church of the body of Christ to do, and it was a courageous thing, and it didn't come easy, and it did create a sense of fear, and in some cases maybe anger, fear that the church was going to go bankrupt, and fear about, well, did this really happen? There was sort of all of that wrestling and grappling. And I think it's important that we remember that truth telling and transformation, especially in the context of our faith, is this essential part to getting to where we need to for new life and for new relationship. It was a difficult time, but there were gifts, and I'll name God's grace, sort of step by step leading us the church through that, through truth telling, holding space, and responding to the survivors and caring for them in various ways throughout. It was a very difficult journey for the survivors as well. And I remember, I'm jumping forward a little bit, but it's related to what I'm talking about, and that's the TRC, the Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And one of the commissioners, Marie Wilson, one of the three commissioners, she spoke at one of the national events early on in the process, and she says, now we're going to have feelings here. We're going to have all kinds of feelings, and it's appropriate. Like, this is part of the process. Truth telling is going to invoke feelings of guilt and anger and all of those things. And she said, but pay attention to them and invite them to teach you something. Allow our feelings to be expressed, to talk with one another, and what is it that these feelings of anger or what have you, or guilt, talk about it. And I think that's part of so reconciliation or transformation or right relations. It's not only about creating new processes and structures, especially in the church. We have to think about, a transformation of our hearts and why we're doing this in the first place, to understand it, at some level here, but at another level right here. I think that's the big journey, is connecting the two. And it was an elder at Cape Croker that taught me that the longest journey, is from here to our hearts. Yeah.
Well, and that is why when we said, there's this history that people need to be aware of, we did decide to do this as a dialogue, that because it is, yes, there are some structures that need to be done, and that needs to be done appropriately by the Indigenous church, but there also needs to be dialogue. The settler church needs to understand what those structures are like, and what they are, and why they are designed the way they are. And that only happens if we talk. So we need to keep talking about the why and the history and the rootedness of who we become.
Yeah, and it's interesting, we talk about the timeline of all the steps that the church has been on, and yet we're still learning that about time in this whole process. It's the Kairos time, and the calls to the church mention that it can't be that Chronos time, because there's two different worldviews about time when you look at Indigenous community and settler community. And so there's going to be a clash, and it's going to take more time. It's going to take more conversation, and and maybe, and I'm hoping, we don't know, which way this remit will go, but I'm hoping that this will be a time in the church where we re-engage in this conversation about truth telling, about about the history of the church, and where we've come from, and where we want to go. And so, yeah, dialogue, like you say, it's so essential to understanding. I mean, we could read books, and that's great too, and there are a lot of resources and videos, but I think, like Marie Wilson said, talk to each other. We sort of have to reason things out together, and struggle together, and celebrate together.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I think we kind of set a time that we wanted to be talking for. Is there anything else that you really wanted to make sure we mention?
I would say one hope, because we talked about the importance of conversation, and that this is sort of one step. This is not a new conversation. We've been at this for a while, and it will continue for a while. One hope is that I know that the Indigenous Church meets this summer for their National Indigenous Spiritual Gathering. It'll be their first since 2019. It'll be good to hear from them, and what they have to say, about the remit. So their leadership, their voice is important as well. I know this is the work of the wider church, of the settler church, and it is true, the work of decolonizing is, but we are also decolonizing within our Indigenous communities. And so it's important that we hear the voice, that we hear the wisdom, and some direction.
We'll look for what comes out of that conversation.
Yes. I have some wonderful words to share as we close.
Yes.
And I hadn't visited these words in a while, and I come across them, thinking about our conversation today. And these words belong to the elder Edith Memnook. She was a representative that met at a meeting in 1988, representative of the All Native Circle Conference, an elder. And this was in response to the 1986 apology to Indigenous peoples. So she offered these words to the church. We only ask of you to respect our sacred fire, the creation, and to live in peaceful coexistence with us. We recognize the hurts and feelings will continue amongst our people, but through partnership and walking hand in hand, the Indian spirit will eventually heal. Through our love, understanding, and sincerity, the brotherhood and sisterhood of unity, strength, and respect can be achieved. The people hope and pray that the apology is not symbolic, but that these are the words of action and sincerity. We appreciate the freedom for culture and religious expression. In the new spirit this apology has created, let us unite our hearts and minds in the wholeness of life that the Great Spirit has given us. And may it be so.
May it be so. Those are words to carry with us as we delve into this particular process. Thank you, Maggie. Thank you so much for this conversation.
You're welcome. Thank you, Cathy.
Greetings. My name is Therese Samuel. I use the pronouns she and her, and I serve as Minister for Right Relations and Social Justice for Antler River Watershed, Horseshoe Falls, and Western Ontario Waterways Regional Councils. I offer some background information to help prepare regional councils and pastoral charge governing bodies to discuss the remit for restructuring of the Indigenous Church. From March 15th, 2023 through March 31st, 2024, every regional council and every pastoral charge governing body, that's the board or council, is being asked to approve an amendment to the Basis of Union authorizing an autonomous Indigenous church structure. This presentation offers an overview of the Doctrine of Discovery, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action, the caretakers' calls to the church, the proposals that led to the remit, and the remit itself. For you, this may be a review or new information, or a little bit of both. It will give a common starting point to discuss the remit. Links to the documents and more information accompany this presentation. We begin with the Doctrine of Discovery. The Doctrine of Discovery is not one document, but is a set of what are called papal bulls, starting in the mid-1400s. Papal bulls were declarations made by popes. The Doctrine of Discovery was a basis of colonization of many lands by European nations. According to this doctrine, if explorers found land that was not inhabited by Christians, it was considered empty, and the explorers could take over the lands. Non-Christian people living there could be made Christian or enslaved or even killed. It combined legal language and Christian terminology and became a basis of international law and laws of many colonizing nations, including Canada. In Canada, the Indian Act, residential schools, and the 60s Scoop are some of the outcomes of this belief system. The United Church of Canada officially repudiated the Doctrine of Discovery in March of 2012, denouncing the Doctrine of Discovery as fundamentally opposed to the gospel of Jesus Christ and a violation of the inherent human rights that all individuals and peoples have received from God. However, repudiating the Doctrine of Discovery is just a first action. It continues to have a lasting impact through past and current laws and practices in the nation and in the church. The United Church continues to work to live into the repudiation of the Doctrine of Discovery. So let's look at 3 documents toward decolonization. From the United Nations, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. From Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the calls to action, and from Indigenous leaders within the United Church of Canada, the caretakers' calls to the church. Starting with the United Nations Declaration. This is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, sometimes referred to as UNDRIP, or the UN Declaration. In 2007, after more than 20 years of consultation between Indigenous peoples and nation-states, the United Nations approved this declaration, but it was opposed by Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. In 2010, Canada endorsed the UN Declaration as an aspirational document but did not implement it. In 2017, Canada became a full supporter of the declaration, and in 2021, Canada passed into law the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, UNDRIPA. This act drew a mix of approval and disapproval from Indigenous groups, but it is what Canada has now as a roadmap for implementing the declaration. The UN Declaration has 46 articles organized around 6 key principles: the right to self-determination, to participate in decision-making, to cultural and spiritual identity, to lands and resources, to free, prior, and informed consent, and to freedom from discrimination. Next, the TRC calls to action. TRC stands for Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and it came about from the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement of 2006. That was the legal settlement between residential school survivors, the Assembly of First Nations, Inuit representatives, and the parties that created and operated the schools, including the United Church of Canada. In events held by the TRC, many deep and painful truths were shared by survivors, families, communities, and others who were affected by the residential schools. In 2015, the Commission released their summary report, which includes 94 calls to action. These calls to action are statements calling for specific actions toward reconciliation by the Canadian government, the church parties to the settlement, including the United Church of Canada, and other sectors of society. And I'd like to highlight one particular call to action, number 48, a call to adopting and complying with the principles, norms, and standards of the UN Declaration, which, among other things, includes respecting Indigenous peoples' right to self-determination in spiritual matters. In 2016, the United Church of Canada expressed a commitment to honoring call to action number 48. The Indigenous Church, along with the non-Indigenous settler church, began a process of consultation to determine the vision and future structure of the Indigenous Church. And this brings us to the caretaker's calls to the church. Now, when you hear calls to the church, know that this is a United Church document, often confused with the TRC calls to action relating to the churches, but it refers to the caretaker's calls to the church, which contains the Indigenous Church's vision for the Indigenous people's ministry and communities of faith within the United Church of Canada. It was written by the caretakers of our Indigenous Circle, who were Indigenous leaders from across the United Church of Canada. It was affirmed by the broader Indigenous Church at the National Aboriginal Spiritual Gathering in 2017 and accepted for implementation by General Council 43 in 2018. Calls to the Church is foundational to the relationship between the Indigenous Church and the rest of the United Church of Canada. The broader Indigenous Church held a series of gatherings in Indigenous communities, and at the 2019 National Indigenous Spiritual Gathering developed a proposal to General Council regarding the current status of the National Indigenous Council and plans for future structure. That proposal was passed by General Council 43 in October of 2019. And that brings us to the proposals that led to the remit. These proposals were brought to the 44th General Council, which met between February and July of 2022. In NIC 01, the National Indigenous Council proposed that the 44th General Council act on the issue of autonomy of the Indigenous Church by directing the General Secretary to identify and remove all the structural barriers to developing and sustaining an autonomous Indigenous Church within the United Church of Canada, consistent with the caretaker's calls to the Church and the UN Declaration, and to continue the conversation of restructuring right relations and reparations with the National Indigenous Circle. In response, the General Secretary presented GS-10, Living into Reconciliation, proposing that the General Council authorize a Category 3 remit to approve a new structure of the Indigenous Church within the United Church and relationship to the settler church to be determined by the Indigenous Church in its own time and through its own processes within the framework of the calls to the church and without the need for further remit approval. And approve shortening the time for study and information sharing for regional councils and pastoral charges from the usual 24 months to 12 months for this remit. Both proposals passed, and here is the remit question. Does the regional council or pastoral charge agree to amend the basis of union to reflect that the United Church of Canada will be organized as follows: a 3-council structure consisting of communities of faith, regional councils, and a denominational council, and an autonomous national Indigenous organization. And that once the new autonomous national Indigenous organization is established within the United Church of Canada, it will have its own mechanisms to make any future changes to its structure and processes, and therefore will not be subject to the remit process, and to reflect the changes required for the establishment of the autonomous national Indigenous organization. So, this remit, if passed, will be movement on the path of living into call to action number 48 in respecting Indigenous people's right to self-determination. About the remit process, it is a Category 3 remit because it will significantly change a structure of the Church. We heard earlier that Category 3 remits can be hard to pass, and that is because in order to pass, they must be approved by a majority of regional councils and pastoral charge governing bodies, and it takes work to get enough pastoral charges to vote. If any regional council or pastoral charge does not send in a vote, it will be registered as a no vote. Links to documents and further information accompany this presentation. The Remit study materials and response forms for your pastoral charges governing body to send in are available on the General Council 44 website, www.generalcouncil44.ca. Remember, the vote of the governing body of each pastoral charge must be received by March 31st, 2024.
Ani Bojo. My name is Martha Pedoniquotte, and I am from the Chippewas of Nawash, Neashingaming at Cape Croker on the Bruce Peninsula. I am currently working for the National Indigenous Council, Indigenous Ministries and Justice Unit as a Community Capacity Development Coordinator, CCDC for short. I work for the Ontario-Quebec East region, and there are currently 3 CCDCs working, with one in the Keewatin area, who is Ray Anderson, and Charlene Burns, who does the west of Canada, Western Canada. We are responsible for building capacity within the Indigenous communities of faith and to have the working relationship with the National Indigenous Council and their advisory groups, general council staff, and all regional councils and their networks. We also work with urban and off-reserve Indigenous people and the Indigenous Office of Vocation and Theological Schools. I'm currently responsible for 24 communities of faith in Ontario and Quebec, but my area expands from southwestern Ontario to the eastern part of Canada. And Ray, who's Keewatin, takes care of northern Ontario. The remit is to remove the barriers for Indigenous people to be a self-determining church. A lot of Indigenous communities that were raised within the United Church still love the church and still want to be a part of the church, but they want to also explore who they are as Indigenous people, because that was taken away from them with residential school and colonization. We want to be in relationship with the non-Indigenous church, but we also want to explore who we are as Indigenous people. So learning our own spirituality on a parallel path with the United Church. So the remit gives us that opportunity to do that, but still stay a part of the United Church. We're asking for autonomy, not separation. And by allowing the remit to go forward, we have the opportunity to explore that and to bring back who we want to be and how we want to be in relationship with the broader church. So in closing, I would just like to say that regardless of the outcome of the remit in 2024, I hope that relationships are still built upon within the United Church, and that people continue to learn about the struggles that Indigenous people have had intergenerationally. We all have a lot of healing to do, and I believe this can only be achieved through our faith and spirituality, however that may look in each individual's lives. Miigwech.